All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt. During my time debating, I competed for Bard College in the US and the LSE in the UK. This workshop is called 10 Common Judging Mistakes and How to Fix Them. I'll be discussing some of the top negative trends I've observed in recent years of contemporary BP judging, as well as my thoughts on how these problems can be addressed. While the workshop is for everyone, I'll try to go a bit beyond the standard judge briefing stare, like don't count arguments, don't give separate scores for style, and so on, and go a bit more intermediate and advanced on some of these things. Four-ish disclaimers before I get into the heart of the workshop. The first is that this is obviously to some extent subjective, right? And by that, well, I mean some of these problems I'll be talking about will be objective errors, like the manual says you should judge like this, and you're judging like not like this. Others will be my own determination. So please understand that not everything I say should be taken as gospel. I'll try to be clear throughout where I'm referencing the world's manual and where I'm making a more subjective judgment, but I can be wrong, norms change, and I encourage you to actively interrogate what I say and think of it as a dialectic contribution to the realm of judging theory rather than an ex cathedra declaration. Secondly, the workshop will focus on broad judging trends, not individual rounds or tournaments or circuits. I'm not involved enough in debating, well, as of last Worlds, to get this granular. And often people who make sweeping judgments about American judging or European judging or whatever tend to be wrong. So I'm going to focus on really macro level trends here. Thirdly, this is not a workshop about developing the sort of macro judging skills like tracking and panel management that are often covered in other workshops. There are some really great in-depth modules on tracking published by the World's Korea team, for example, if you'd like help with that. My friends Nick and Enting published a really comprehensive written guide on how to improve at wing judging. There are surely more workshops out there in recent years that I'm just not familiar with. I recommend checking those out as a supplement to what I'm going to share today, because those can help with some of the more fundamental skills. Finally, I'll keep this focused on judging practices as opposed to some of the other problems in judging would often get highlighted. So like implicit biases, equity issues, and so on. I think there's a lot to say in debating about how we as a community can get better at listening to WGM and ELSL speakers. And there have been a lot of really great conversations raised about this in serious posting lately. I think these issues are incredibly important and deserve a workshop dedicated to them too. But I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm likely not the best person to speak on this. And so we'll see that space. Hopefully others will talk about it. With that out of the way, then, let's get started. I'll try not to be too long-winded and leave time for questions at the end. The first trend I wanted to spotlight at the start, and this will kick off the sort of top or bottom 10 judging trends in modern debating, is generally being too non-interventionist against implausible or untrue claims. And I think if I had to pick one thing on the list, this is probably my biggest bugbear with modern judging. As a rule, I'm not saying all modern judges do this or even the majority, but this is the most commonly recurring trend that I find myself in disagreement with. What I'm talking about is basically when teams make a claim that has a bunch of mechanistic justifications in order to prove a premise, which is either like prima facie implausible or untrue. And I don't blame judges fully for this, because I think one of the biggest stories of the past 5 years of debating has been a trend towards the sport becoming increasingly analytical, where the rounds increasingly demanding denser and denser speeches. And I'll take some of the blame for this. I definitely pushed debating in this trend as well during my speaking career. With that, though, has come an implicit presumption that when comparing two teams' analysis in a debate, the one that is likely winning is the team that provided more analytically rigorous claims. But the problem is this isn't always true, or shouldn't always be true. So to illustrate what I mean, suppose a situation in which a team makes claims that have a million mechanisms which claim that Germany and Singapore are strongly reliant on imports and are net importers, as opposed to the true inverse, that they're two of the world's most notable exporters. And say the team has many mechanisms for this, and their case is entirely reliant on this premise to function, but they analyze this claim, untrue claim, really well. Another team points out the empirical reality that this is untrue, but their own case is much less analytically rigorous. What should you do? Well, you should credit the true claim, not the claim that was analyzed, quote unquote, better. And this kind of thing happens a lot in IR debates. And another common situation that comes up is when teams just make claims by essentially cross-applying country-specific knowledge to another country. So I was in a round once when a team tried to analogize India's domestic policies to that of a Eastern European country, to which India is not particularly comparable. I've also seen teams try to claim Iran is very similar in nature to North Korea when their political structures are quite different, particularly in motions about the recent Iran conflict. In general, I think teams should be willing to just scrutinize this stuff a bit more thoroughly than I often see them do, and be more willing to drop teams for using analysis to compensate for blatantly incorrect facts. In general, I think the thing to remember when you're judging is that analytical rigor is not a substitute in and of itself for factual accuracy in claims, and teams don't get points purely for volume and detail of analysis. If they're trying to prove an untrue premise, this should be looked upon negatively. Now, there are a couple of things I think judges can do to address this issue, because I think that often these criticisms get pointed out in places like serious posting, but there's not a lot of effort put in to sort of explain how to best correct for that. And the first is, I think it helps to be really well read. And while you shouldn't be expected to have granular monetary policy knowledge, being familiar with relevant OIV level facts about specific countries that appeared in the front pages of newspapers will just be a massive benefit to your credibility as a judge. Being able to discuss the reality of situations, even just in individual feedback and debates, your judging is just like a massive credibility boost and a super easy way to set yourself apart from other adjudicators. So a fun fact from the European circuit that you may not be familiar with is that there was an experiment run at LSE Open last year where a judge came up with a series of questions that the ordinary intelligent voter is supposed to know and presented them to judges at the social. And very few people got a perfect score, even scored in the 80th percentile. And like full disclosure, I got one of these wrong. Being widely read incidentally just helps you have a better ability to sort of filter out obviously economically illiterate or geopolitically naive arguments as well, which can be just a huge boost to your credibility as a judge, and also will set you apart in a really, really niche category. Secondly, judges should be more willing to intervene against teams that present blatantly false information as fact. And the line I think you should draw here is, because you're probably wondering, well, where's the line I should draw then? How much should I know? How much can I intervene with spec? I don't want to be criticizing that judge who said, I let my spec knowledge get in the way of judging around fairly and objectively. And that's a good question. And the line you should draw is this something that credibly could have or did appear in a major newspaper? I.e., is this ordinary intelligent voter knowledge? And I think more in general is ordinary intelligent voter knowledge than teams or judges often think. Like, for instance, I think the example about Germany and Singapore I gave earlier is textbook ordinary intelligent voter, but some people might contest this, even though it's pretty clearly covered in front page news articles. Similarly, I think judges should frown upon teams and take a dim view of teams trying to use tactics like, this is not something you should know as the OIV, therefore don't credit this fact claim, when it refers to something that's very much public knowledge. Like, I don't know, Temu is a Chinese company or Shein is a Chinese company. And judges should be more willing to take a stern stance on this, more than I think sometimes judges currently do. In general, I think like, even if you're unsure and you're not like 100% convinced or 100% like certain that this is OIV knowledge or this isn't OIV knowledge, this is the kind of thing to like make a note of and then come back to it in future rounds to see if it actually was OIV, to look at it after the debate is done and things like that. The third thing you can do is utilize your panelists to correct for both lack of knowledge and having too much knowledge. So if I go into a round, for example, where I don't have a lot of spec, but my panelist appears to know a lot, there's no shame in hearing them out and letting them help you parse the discussion. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but the objective of a panel discussion isn't to win, right? It's to get to the correct call. So there's no shame if you aren't familiar with a fact or you aren't sure what is true to solicit opinions from your panel. Similarly, if I have the inverse problem, i.e. I have a lot of spec knowledge about a round, I'll ask my panelists to check me and make sure I'm staying within the parameters of OIV knowledge. So that's the inverse, obviously not the problem I'm pointing out, but you should utilize your panelists to correct for multiple potential deficiencies you might have in the discussion. So to sum this all up, I think in general, this largely comes down to having a pretty good intuition filter for what is a plausible claim and what is not. And obviously that's like a really big thing and could almost be like considered a judging problem in itself. But the way you get better identifying those heuristics, especially where you need to intervene against implausible or untrue claims, is by expanding your knowledge base, especially for debates like IR, economics, and things like that, but also being more willing, even if you have that knowledge, to intervene against things that are untrue and are ordinary intelligent voter knowledge that they are untrue. So having the sort of, I guess, courage or being more willing to do that, like giving yourself the permission to do that, will be, I think, really helpful in that way. So reading and being bold, I think, are the two ways to sort of address this issue. The second major judging trend that I've observed that I think is potentially problematic has to do with the inefficient tracking and crediting of responsive material relative to constructive material. So moving away a bit from intervening on claims, I think this is also one of the biggest issues of some modern judging. And it's also down to how modern debating became increasingly analysis heavy and material increasingly dense, which is why I put these two sort of together. The problem is that judges are, in my view, often not effectively tracking, crediting, or discussing responsive material to the same degree relative to constructive material in DLib. And I don't think this is like wholly a symptom of a bad thing. I think judges' ability to parse, dissect, and analyze constructive material has improved massively since when I started debating. In general, judges have a much better round recall, much better tracking on aggregate than they did 10 years ago when I started debating. That said, I think tracking of responsive material hasn't improved at that commensurate pace, or in some cases may has even atrophied a bit, although that may be a bit more of a subjective claim. This is down to a few factors. The first is that the most responsive speeches in a debate are typically whip speeches. And maybe this is down to like a generational thing and Zoomer attention spans being poor because you spend too much time on the TikTok or whatever. But I feel like tracking whip speeches seems to be a serious problem in the circuit right now. So much so that that could be its own entry on the list. I've heard judges, and I won't name names here because I promised I won't, literally admit to me that they don't track whip speeches, especially when they're judging online. They just sit there and listen or not listen. And that's not great. But this is also due to responsive exchanges often being just more difficult to parse than constructive argumentation, because there are often many responses that form a sort of argumentative chain in a debate, right? So a PM will make a claim that will get refuted by LO, LO will be refuted by DPM, DLO will refute DLO, DLO will refute DPM, but there may also be multiple degrees of interlinking responses within those responses. And these responses are often shorter or more numerous. And because speakers don't always present them neatly, you often have to do the extra brain work to just piece together as a judge how all the responses interact with each other, especially on diagonals. So all this leads to DLibs, largely ending up discussing headlines of each team's cases and comparing those headlines against one another, rather than evaluating the headlines evaluating the analysis on the credibility of responsive material. It's more like judges are looking at just the headlines and evaluating their general plausibility or something like that, right? And the problem with this is that what winds up happening when you do this is you end up missing out on a lot of these sort of key and granular nuances and how they interact with one another, because just crediting those headlines, evaluating those headlines, or evaluating constructive material in a vacuum will likely lead you down the path of missing out on potentially how those interactions can sway close or messy debates. And this problem usually does come down to tracking. And I think that's a sort of like the first thing that needs to be addressed here before I get into some of the more normative solutions to the problem. So what I like to do in order to sort of alleviate this as a tracking issue, and that's like the first step, is to track the chain of responses separately in some way. So I'll track constructive material on one sheet of paper if I'm judging with paper notes, and then I'll track it on a separate sheet of paper, how the responsive material interacts with one another, in order to sort of keep a logical flow of how all the chains of responses interact with one another. If I'm using a laptop to judge, then I'll use like a different color or a font style on a laptop, or I'll use like I'll bold or italicize something in order to make clear that this is a response as opposed to constructive material, just so I'm able to parse more clearly how the chain of responses all interacts with one another. That said, it's not just a tracking thing. I think this also comes down to some normative shifts that can potentially be worth correcting for. The first is that chairs also have an additional responsibility here, which is to direct the discussion in the direction of evaluating responsive claims. So something I've tried to do, especially as I've noticed this trend, is to get my panelists to actively discuss with me how responsive exchanges played out, even in debates where it's relatively simple to see who won just from comparing constructive analysis. I think this teaches good practices, and it's especially important for evaluating more complex or messier debates. Not always more high-level debates, by the way. You can often have a debate that is like relatively in the median room, for example, and those might become the most messy because maybe there are some key deficiencies in each constructive case, and then the debate really does come down to evaluating responses specifically. So to sum this up, if newer or less experienced, check out workshops that focus on tracking to sort of fix the level 1 problem, which is parse the responses effectively. But then if you're chairing rounds regularly at a tournament, try to direct discussions towards evaluating responsive claims, because it will teach good practices and good habits for when you do run into that debate where you really can't judge it without evaluating the responsive claims very thoroughly in order to get to a correct call. And it will help you end up evaluating those more efficiently and more effectively. The other thing I think you can do, in addition, in terms of like normative shifts, if you're a panelist as well, is you can flag these responses to your chair. Now, obviously, you want to be concise, precise, and accurate and don't derail discussions or anything like that. But if you have a question about how a responsive piece of material played into the round, or you feel it hasn't been discussed, you are perfectly within your rights to be like, I had a question about how this responsive material in team X interacted with team Y's constructive claim. Can we talk about that for a second, or would that be unconstructive to the discussion? And many chairs will humor that. And if they don't, it's still not something that you should feel bad about raising, because often this can be very decisive in determining close comparisons. The third and fourth number on this list have to do with more broad trends, and I've grouped them together as 3 and 4, and I'll talk about them separately. But the umbrella headline for both of these next points is evaluating extensions. So this one's tough because there are multiple trends here, both towards over and under crediting extensions that are happening simultaneously for different reasons in some parts of debating. I'll discuss them separately, but we'll note that probably all of this arises from the fact that diagonal comparisons are just hard to judge. It's just a difficult feature of the sport, and people make mistakes judging them. That's a feature of the game, not a bug, unfortunately. And so it's not really an indictment of the circuit or any circuit, merely just, if anything, an indictment of the way BP as a game works, right? So insofar as that's true, it's probably not something you can solve for unless you wanted to radically rethink the way the BP format functions, which is beyond the scope of this exercise here. So given we have to live with that, I'll talk about the trends, what they are, and how to sort of address them normatively. The first is being too punitive, and this is the third thing to note on my list, the third trend on my list. Some judges are just a bit too punitive on extensions these days, especially extensions which lack elaborate meta-level bench weighing or use similar language as opening teams. And I almost call this being punitive on vertical extensions, because this often does happen with vertical extensions, where you see teams will run a vertical that's quite similar to a team that ran something in opening, but they fill in a few key burdens that the opening team just didn't meet, and they are still dropped due to being derivative. But the problem is actually quite a bit broader than this, because often judges are even more punitive on horizontal extensions, I think sometimes incorrectly, which they feel failed to meet burdens that they end up inserting in order to ensure that the closing team cannot win intentionally or unintentionally, right? Generally, I think you should pay close attention as a judge to whether or not undue scrutiny is being applied to these kinds of teams, because I think this can be a real issue, both in terms of balance, right? Like opening teams speak first, they have the first crack at a lot of material. And insofar as judges are more willing, in my view, to read into additional burdens onto closing teams, this skews the balance of the sport a bit in a way that I don't think is necessarily fair for closing teams. But secondly, I think that sometimes the burdens that are demanded on closing teams can verge a bit on the absurd. And what I mean by this is that if you expect a team in closing to not only provide better analysis than their opening and effectively position that analysis in the round, if they also have to sort of weigh it on the meta level, like explain why they beat their opening in great detail in sort of the meta debate function, our analysis was more offensive, less defensive, whatever, you're putting a much higher burden on them than the opening team, which many opening teams good ones might do preemptive weighing, but it's not something that's demanded. And it's not something that often opening teams are sort of penalized for not doing, right? Now, and I think here that the reason this ends up happening is because judges misunderstand a key element of debate, which is that, yes, teams that are responding to previous teams often do have a higher burden of engagement because they have to engage with what came before and overcome what had come before. And I'll talk about that next trend a little bit later. But that doesn't mean just because closing teams must prove that their analysis is substantially better, that they need to both prove their analysis substantially better and then also do the meta work of convincing you in the abstract that their analysis is better as well. Judges should be able to make a judgment call in cases where it's very clear that a closing team has provided better analysis, that the closing team wins. If it's very close, it's perfectly reasonable to say the bench weighing was the deciding factor, right? That's fine, because that's what weighing is for. But if it's very clear, you shouldn't put an additional penalty on the team for failing to meet a burden that you've inserted in order for the closing team not to be able to win. So generally, I think you should pay close attention to whether or not undue scrutiny is being applied to teams. And a good sign is if the closing team provided analysis much better, but didn't bench weigh, or if the closing team provided analysis much better, but didn't fulfill, I don't know, a specific burden that their opening also did that was non-essential for the round to win. Potentially, this should not be the deciding factor in the way in which the decision is broken down. But it's far from the only heuristic you can apply here. You can also just, in general, do a bit more scrutiny on how you evaluate closing teams and their contributions. That said, there's also another problem, and this is a another trend that I've observed, which is that some judges are too generous, which brings me to the sort of fourth piece in the workshop. So after I've just spent a long time talking about how many judges are too punitive on extensions and demand sort of elaborate additional weighing that isn't necessary for them to win, even if the team has done their job well enough to win. Some judges have the inverse problem, which is judges will end up over-crediting an extension relative to what an opening team has provided. And I'll talk, this is like a different problem for different types of judges, and I'll talk about that a bit in a minute. But sometimes the inverse of the pre-extension problem occurs. And what happens specifically is a judge will identify that a piece of closing half framing has provided a viable path to win the debate, but then they will confuse that for that framing has won the debate. In other words, what happens is the closing team identifies a viable strategy or a viable framing that allows them to enter into the debate and provides them a plausible pathway to win. But then the judge misunderstands that for that viable path that has been shown to me wins the debate without doing due diligence on whether or not the analysis in the closing half has won the debate, right? And I think this is a problem with different sorts of judges than those that have the first problem. I think newer judges tend to have this problem more frequently, where they'll misidentify a potentially winning framing and extension as the winning extension, whereas more experienced judges tend to have the inverse problem with undercrediting extensions, which I detailed earlier. So for the second group, which is overcrediting extensions, the heuristic you want to follow to correct for this is the one I sort of hinted at in the previous point, which is generally, as a judge in OA, you want to be able to explain why X analysis, which has been established in a debate, is beaten by Y later in a coherent and cogent way. In other words, you should never be justifying in OA things like, we just bought this analysis in a vacuum, or this is good because it makes strategic observation X, which was important to the debate, in a vacuum. It needs to be compared to see if it is actually winning, not just if it could win if it's made to completion. And often teams will do their best to try to, I believe the term is scam you into believing that the extension won by basically saying we win a bunch of times and explaining how their framing, if proven, can win. But again, this comes down to the first trend, which I talked about. While I talked about it in the context of being willing to intervene against implausible claims, it also applies to being able to intervene against claims that are, asserted, not proven fully. And here, I think this is, again, an experience thing. It can come from just doing a lot more judging. That can give you sort of a better intuition for when an argument is actually completed, as opposed to an argument is an interesting or good strategic observation that is on the right track, not an argument that wins. Now, I've just talked about two extremes, right? Where some judges are too punitive on extensions and other judges are, I guess, not punitive enough or are too credulous of extensions. So the Goldilocks spot, or the sweet spot between these two extremes is you shouldn't demand unrealistic expectations for closing teams beyond what you demand of other teams, right? So you should apply the same burdens and scrutiny to opening teams as you would to a closing team. Be very willing to interrogate whether an opening team that matter burned a bunch of material on top half has actually proven those links, right? And scrutinize whether or not they actually meet the burdens they claim to in the same way you would scrutinize a closing team in comparison to the opening team. But also, at the same time, you should apply the same scrutiny to extensions you do to material at DLO which refutes DPM, i.e., if you're comparing DLO to DPM on a top half comparison, you're going to be asking yourself, does DLO's new material Y actually take down X? If so, great. If not, well, it probably loses. So you should definitely still consider whether or not the extension can overwhelm or can override the material at opening, but it should be done in a manner that is applying an equal burden, right? Not an overly punitive one, right? The same responsive burden does, obviously you're still applying the responsive burden. You're still making sure that you are evaluating responsive material in a way that is comparative with other material, and sometimes that will lead to a higher burden being placed on responsive material, obviously, or material that came later in a debate. But extensions should not be you should not apply undue pressure or undue burdens on extensions that go far beyond what you would scrutinize an opening team for in the same context, i.e., if DLO's material took down DPM and so on and so forth. Hopefully that's clear. In general, obviously, it's a bit flippant to say the solution is to judge more. I think that's part of it. But I also think having just a really clear and sort of compelling idea in your own mind as to what it takes for an argument to be considered sufficiently proven and what it takes for an argument to sufficiently overcome a previous claim in a debate is just a really good and important thing to try to identify. And I think it again comes down to being willing to put a lot of scrutiny on potentially implausible claims. And if you can master this will also set you apart as a judge, I think, because often a complaint that teams will have is that comparisons on diagonals are not justified as well as they could be, or comparisons on diagonals are not as clearly justified as they could be. And that's something that just gets a lot of criticism and will draw a lot of salty feedback. As someone who's seen it a fair bit, I can attest to this. As someone who's been the recipient of salty feedback, I can attest to this. And I think it's because there's nothing more soul crushing as a speaker. If you put yourself in the speaker's shoes, that there's nothing more soul crushing than to get up and deliver, like, I don't know, a great DLO or whatever. And then you sit down and then a closing team just like gets up and identifies a good strategic pathway and doesn't prove much. And then you take a second or a third because the judge just bought into the setup that the team did, but then the team didn't actually follow through and the judge read in that analysis. You can feel your soul slipping away from your body when you see that a judge is buying this, and it's very upsetting. And obviously sometimes the judge is right and sometimes you're wrong and you didn't prove it as well as you wanted to. But being able to work on scrutinizing how much or to what extent a closing team proved X, while at the same time being fair-minded and willing to apply equal burdens to opening and closing teams in that regard, will elevate your judging quite a bit and will give you a more coherent way of justifying diagonals when you are judging in the future. Because if you're applying these heuristics, if you're actually thinking, does X, which was established earlier, actually get overcome by Y, which is sent later? Or if you're thinking, did this team provide meaningfully better analysis than the opening team, regardless of whether or not they fulfilled X meta level weighing obligation, whatever, you're likely to get better feedback and you're likely to be able to justify it in a more detailed way, as opposed to just saying, we liked this weighing here, we like this framing here, which is another judge mistake that I'll get to a little bit later. The fifth trend, and I'll move on a little bit faster now. I realize I got a bit stuck there. Lots to say about extensions, is overcrediting framing. Framing is a really important skill, but a problem I've seen is that a lot of judges will overcredit it. And I just talked about a scenario where you overcredit framing on back half in order to sort of talk about extensions, but this can also happen on top half or just in any context as well, where a team will provide a piece of framing that gets bought in even if challenged later by other teams. If you look at the teams that do the best with framing, like Belgrade A in 2020, Sofia A 2026, and so on, these teams also back this characterization up with analysis and make robust arguments. The framing in and of itself is not usually sufficient on its own to win. That's not to say it can't be, but a trend I've observed is that framing, even if analytically unsupported and the overall case is losing, can end up getting too much credit. How do you address this as a judge? First, try to think critically about how much was actually said and how many additional steps of logic you need to insert yourself into the debate in order to justify your claim. In general, the fewer logical leaps you need to make, the better this will go for you as a judge, right? And in general, the fewer logical leaps you need to make when comparing framing against one another is also a good way to disambiguate good framing from bad framing. But secondly, and this is equally important, try to parse when taking notes the distinction between descriptive claims, which have a strategic impact in the debate, right? So framing, characterization, that kind of stuff, and argumentative claims, which advance the persuasiveness of the team. Keeping that distinction in your head, even though it's obviously artificial, right? Framing can advance an argument. Characterization can also advance an argument. Some arguments may end up becoming more descriptive in nature, but just keeping an idea that these things can be distinct, right? Keeping an idea that some parts of an argument are characterization, some parts of an argument are analysis that advances the persuasiveness of the case, can help you think more critically about how much heavy lifting the framing actually does to prove the case. And thirdly, and maybe controversially, this is one of the things I think where practicing speaking really helps. I know that these are disparate skills, and you can definitely be a good speaker without being a good judge and vice versa, but you don't need to become a world's top 10 speaker to reap a lot of benefits from doing a little bit of speaking on the side for your judging. In general, I find that speaking and getting feedback helps you, from people, helps you learn a fundamental judging skill, which is where the line is between an assertion and a proving claim. And this is really important when you're looking at parts of argumentation that may or may not be over or under credited. And this isn't something I can teach you identify in this workshop, unfortunately. It's something you have to develop a sense for after a while speaking and also judging. But speaking and getting feedback from other judges really helps speed the process along faster because it gives you a better ability to instinctively disambiguate between a claim that is interesting and potentially very cool if proven to its fullest extent, and framing that is actually debate winning and actually takes out a team's argument or ends up causing a significant impact in them. That's, I think, potentially controversial, but I think really, really helpful. And I think in general, something that I think if you want to improve as a judge, speaking is not a bad idea. I think similarly, if you want to improve as a speaker, you should definitely judge a little bit because it gives you the ability to understand where judges draw those lines as well. And then you're able to sort of figure out those things in the inverse as well. But that's a subject for another day. The sixth thing I want to talk about then is about panel management and inefficient use of a panel. The role of a panel is not just less experienced judges who you need to flip to your call. The idea is to genuinely make use of having multiple people to come to some kind of consensus. And the reason I highlight this is because I think or I've been told that often what ends up happening in DLibs is that things can become a bit messy, either because the chair doesn't have a clear idea of where to direct the discussion, or because the chair becomes bogged down a bit too much in trying to win a discussion. And this is not really a modern judging trend problem. This has been a problem as long as the panel format has been a thing in BP, I assume. And it usually comes down to a few things, either the chair being an inefficient facilitator or panelists being inefficient participants. I won't go too much into the panelist role in this because I think there's a great guide on published by Enting and Nick that sort of highlights, I think, the fundamentals of how to be a good and useful wing judge. That's like super useful. But I will say that there's a couple of things as chairs that I think are specific, I guess, to more recent debate trends, especially as just more debate has happened, that I think you can work on in order to make your DLibs more efficient. The first and probably most obvious thing is you should have an initial call at the end of DLib. If you don't do, weird horse trading will often ensue, and that leads to the discussion becoming very messy. At the same time, you should try to keep an open mind that there might be stuff you missed and genuinely assess areas of disagreement. Panels are not just an exercise for you to prove that you are the smartest person on the panel or that you have the right call. You should be flippable and you should be persuadable. I've been persuaded by panelists many times, including at the most recent Worlds. It's something that is important and something you should keep in mind in general. But with that being said, you want to make efficient use of the panelists as well and efficient use of the discussion. And the best way to do that is to either have them check your intuitions, as I talked about before, or summarize key points of analysis that are contentious in the round. So I think here, this is where sort of some of the other stuff I've talked about, like tracking and really disambiguating constructive from responsive material, framing from constructive material, from other kinds of constructive material, can really, really help, because then you can point to specific areas that may potentially be contentious in a round or a discussion. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that you can discuss here, i.e. Panel management is an art, and there are many, many ways to do it. And I'm not going to be prescriptive about how you best do it. But in general, I think you want to make use of the panelists to identify key areas of disagreement, construct their arguments, even if they're less experienced than you, in the most clear and relevant way as possible in order to make the most out of their contribution to the debate. And try to find areas wherein your own logic may be unsound or may be overcrediting or undercrediting a team as well. So try to genuinely, obviously, you don't abandon your call just because panelists are strongly convinced if you feel it's wrong, but keep an open mind about where and how there may be an area of disagreement, why that disagreement might arise, and it will ultimately strengthen the call you come to at the end. I think talking more about this probably goes beyond the scope of what I'm meant to talk about here. But if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to talk at length about panel management afterward. Or you can PM me on Facebook and I can talk about that more. The seventh thing I want to highlight is the use of abstract debate jargon in OAs and RFDs. And this is, I think, one that largely stems from judges who are a little bit less experienced, or judges who had a hard time parsing a lot of the material that ends up getting put forward in a debate, right? And this looks like judges saying, we just didn't buy your mechs, right? Or you were off clash with no further explanation as to what the clash might have been. And it's worth keeping in mind that in general, the purpose of an OA is to explain why something was unpersuasive, not collapse it all down into debate jargon, right? And obviously this isn't always the fault of the chair. Some debates are genuinely confusing, and sometimes you might default to saying the thing that you think is just the easiest way to sort of sum up a claim. But often debaters are not as embedded in debating as you are. Many might be newer, many might not be familiar with the terminology. There might be circuit differences in terminology. And once you bring in this debate jargon without clearly explicating it and without clearly explaining how it ends up applying in the context of the debate that actually happened, you end up losing a lot of credibility with the people who you're judging, and this can end up hurting your judge score. How do you address this, though? Because well, the first part is obviously, and this is, I guess, the tongue-in-cheek answer, is if you paid attention to what I've said so far, there are a few common threads that I've echoed in quite a few of these so far, which is you want to clearly outline different types of analysis, how it interacts with one another, track very clearly, but not only track very clearly, keep in mind how different parts of speeches interact with one another and be comparative at all times, right? The sort of basic building blocks of judging you should be executing on all cylinders here, because it makes it easier for you to break all those things down. But secondly, I think trying to talk to your panelists in just human language and sort of breaking down or distilling what exactly was unpersuasive or where exactly the persuasion ended up like failing can be really helpful. And I've seen judges do this very effectively. I'm not one of them, where they can just like find a really clear or intuitive reason why the logic would not persuade the average person on the street, right? Outside of a debate, right? Where they can distill it down into a scenario very far removed from debating. If you can do that, that's great. If you can't, though, what you want to do is you want to look at specifically, not just where quote unquote the burden fell or quote unquote the clash fell in the round, but why precisely the material could not wind up winning over other teams in sort of simple, easy to explain terminology. So instead of we didn't buy your mix, right? You would say, this team did not proved X to a significantly greater degree than Y, which we thought was the most important issue of the debate because, I don't know, if the debate is something about US intervention in the Middle East, for example, they prove that you save the greatest number of lives more than you do. I think it's intuitive why saving more lives matters to the average intelligent voter, given they proved it more thoroughly than you end up taking the debate, right? Or this specific reason you gave as to why intervention will save more lives was unpersuasive because it's hard to understand how if you intervene, it will make the populace like you more as opposed to backlash against you, right? Without explaining why they'll actually like you. You didn't explain why the rulers of this country are disliked, for example, and therefore your material falls out of the debate, right? So giving some specific reasons as to why the claim was unpersuasive, as opposed to boiling it down to the sort of like generic debate jargon, is probably the most effective way at improving at this. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is a potentially more niche one, is overly prescriptive applications of burdens. And that's to say, I've noticed something in briefings lately, which is a claim that's like, an argument is persuasive only if it fills X burden, or an extension is new if it fills Y burden that the front half did not prove. And those things might be true in some rounds, but they're not necessarily true in all rounds, right? And I think this is a problem because the only specific burden that an argument needs to fill in order to win is for it to be meaningfully more persuasive than a claim that was made previously in the round, right? And given that there are no automatic fourths, no specific burdens on specific types of arguments, I think it's really important to sort of, I don't know, impress upon the community that as far as the world's manual goes, at least for now, or the Euro's manual goes, at least for now, there are no specific criterion that these extensions need to fulfill in order to win over a front half team. There are no specific burdens they need to meet. Similarly, there's no specific burdens a front half speech needs to meet in order for it to win in a vacuum, right? Obviously, many things can additively add to persuasion, right? And obviously, you should make claims, you should fill 7 minutes, you should structure your speech in a certain way, probably if you'd like to win. But insofar as no one automatically loses, and insofar as no one, insofar as any team can be worse than the team that came before it, any team can be better than the team that came before it, there shouldn't be an external arbitrary burden being applied to all types of speeches at any point beyond what is stipulated in the rule fulfillment section of the manual, right? And that one might be a bit niche, but I do think it's important to clarify because it is a trend I've seen more and more lately. I think it's important to note that at least as of this recording, March 2026, there are no specific burdens for specific argument types beyond being persuasive and whatever the rule fulfillment section of the manual says, which, to be honest, the vast majority of it doesn't really demand or is prescriptive about anything really beyond you should make coherent arguments and they should be persuasive. And insofar as it specifies it beyond that, it doesn't specify it to the degree that it would imply a specific burden, right? Just to give an example of this would be like a vertical extension wins if it fills X burden. No, a vertical extension wins if it's meaningfully more persuasive than the opening team's extension, right? Obviously, it can't be derivative, whatever, but that's not the point. The ninth is another one of these more recent trends I've noticed. And this is maybe also a bit niche, but I do think it's important to highlight as well. And this is something that I see a lot of experienced judges fall into a bit more. And this is, again, I guess a common problem, but I think it has been exacerbated by the fact that we all do a lot more debating now than we used to. There's an online tournament every weekend. There's more BP being done. And I think that's a great thing. But what that has done to the sport is that it's made stock argumentation way more accessible than it used to be. And it was already pretty accessible when I was debating, but now there are millions of matter files online, and stock argumentation that began as like, I don't know, Manchester Debating Union stuff. Shout out to Lucy and Reese for that. Has now been refined into material that is repeated in a million different debates. And the problem with this is that judges are familiar with it too. So what winds up happening is they fill in gaps in analysis too much for speakers as a result of being familiar with, say, Ryan Lafferty's matter file. And this happens a lot to people who've just done a lot of judging. They've heard the stock a million times and they hear it again, and then they fill in the gaps, even if it wasn't proven in the round. And this is just a problem that people who judge a lot or speak a lot have. And I catch myself sometimes falling into the trap as well, where I'm like listening to a round and judging, and I hear a team making an argument I've heard many times before. And then mid that explanation, I'll end up basically having to catch myself and be like, no, they didn't actually prove that. They headlined the claim, but then they didn't actually analyze it. I'm filling in pattern recognition from previous debates as opposed to analyzing the debate that actually happened here and now. And obviously, there's some easy and intuitive ways to correct for this in theory, right? Which is like, you should obviously remind yourself that every debate is a new debate. You should, pay extra careful attention, be very alert, all the kinds of things I've said before. But I think this one has an even easier situation than just like being really attentive, clearly disambiguating material, and judging each debate as an individual rather than a unit. I think that's to just touch grass a bit. Like, it doesn't mean necessarily take a weekend off. If you really love debate, I'm not going to dissuade you from doing it. I did it every weekend for a really long time. But you should spend some time talking to people who do no debate, who are really smart. Or you should spend some time interacting with the world in a way that's very distinct from debating, right? Like, I don't know, taking up another sport or something on the side. Or just in general, interacting with a group of people who aren't familiar with terms like delta, comparative, whatever. And the reason why that's useful, I think, is because it gives you a bit more of a perception filter for what's persuasive in average conversation to the average individual, right? And there's a big distinction between what's persuasive in some debates and what's persuasive outside. There's also overlap. Many things that are persuasive in debate are persuasive in real life, but some things aren't, right? And some stock especially isn't, because often it was created for one debate or one type of debate and then transplanted many, many times over into different debates. And as a result, it becomes a bit generic and a bit less persuasive than analysis is actually reactive, responsive, and calibrated to a debate, right? And I think the less you, as a judge, being familiar with stock argumentation is good, but the less you become fixated on it and the less you allow your familiarity with the stock argumentation to give you the biases of someone who operates in the circuit, the less likely you're going to be bamboozled by the speakers who do this, right? And the problem also becomes that the more familiar you become with the stock analysis, the more you internalize biases that other people in the circuit have towards those arguments. Because these stock arguments have been discussed so much, if you go on Serious Posting, you see a million different workshops or a million different discussions by prominent debaters who have thoughts on these things. And all of that's really good. And we should encourage people to be evolving the community in that direction. You should look at it. But at the same time, looking at it should be counterbalanced by looking at what, I don't know, the average voter you're trying to embody finds persuasive as well, such that you aren't too punitive on a novel argument when it comes up, as opposed to the stock you've heard many times before, such that you aren't filling in gaps for stock argumentation, such that it ends up shutting out a back half team who has to often default to analysis that's less stock because the stock has been burned in the front half, right? And what winds up happening as a result of you doing this is it means you end up coming to, I think, more balanced and equitable calls in general, while also not over-crediting speakers who have a specific style or talent or knack to emulate speakers who have come before in a really good way. And obviously that is a talent that should be encouraged, but it's not the only thing debating is. And I think debating would be really boring if everyone repeated the same arguments over and over again, and those arguments were the only ones that could win. So the deeper you are into the circuit, I think the more you need to hear this. It's really useful to take stock and take a reality check as to what kinds of arguments debaters find persuasive and what kinds of arguments the average individual would find persuasive. I think many of the claims that debaters have refined into extremely nuanced and interesting mechanisms as to why life is suffering would not be remotely persuasive to the average individual if you met them on the street. And I do think that's important. And I'm not saying don't credit those claims necessarily in a debate that happens. And I'm not saying that that argument in specific is always unpersuasive. What I'm trying to highlight is that if you immerse yourself in the world of debating too much to the exclusion of the world outside debating, you will wind up internalizing the biases that the circuit has as opposed to the biases that the OIV has. And it's important to be aware of the biases the circuit has, but also be aware that the biases of the circuit should not be your biases as a judge. And it will lead to you making more equitable calls, more fair calls, and things like that. So touch grass, go outside, as the kids say. And I think that will improve your judging and help your judging a lot. That brings us now to the 10th and final thing on my list. And I couldn't really condense this into one point because it's actually many points. And so I cheated a bit and I grouped it all together and I called it OA hygiene, or oral hygiene, including including many different elements of giving an OA. I talked about OAs a bit earlier and how they can be improved by sort of adhering to some of the other recommendations I've given in this workshop. But there are a few additional things I want to highlight, and I'll do it fairly quickly because I'm cognizant I've gone on for like 45 minutes now. The first is long preambulatory feedback prior to giving the call. In general, no one is listening until you get to the call unless it's genuinely brief and concise. I do general feedback, but usually I keep it very specific to a few things in the round, very quick, and I don't go over a minute or two because nobody listens beyond that. Secondly, it's really important to do detailed diagonal comparisons. You should either explicitly discuss all 6 comparisons or make it super clear through the discussion of the debate why each split played out the way it did without defaulting to sort of base transitivity. Really important to discuss all 6 as best you can. This is a trend that I've seen I've seen happen in many different places around the world, but I do think it's just something to keep in mind, especially if you're less experienced. Doing all those comparisons is good. Obviously, keep it under 15 minutes or the tab CAs will be unhappy with you. And finally, try to demarcate very clearly where personal feedback comes in and where the sort of explanation of the call comes in. The OA should be the explanation of the call, and personal feedback should be generally kept more to a minimum, in my view. Some judges have different philosophies on this, but in general, if you can say it to a team specifically outside of the confines of the OA, it's better to do that. And feedback, insofar as it is integrated into the OA, should, in my view, generally be brief. I'll also note, and this is just something, this is like a trend I've observed in OAs lately. I don't know if it's a modern debating trend or anything like that. It might just be a general OA thing. But I think that one piece of feedback I've given a lot to judges who want to know how they can not make teams upset or salty in rounds is try to utilize teams' explanations in your OA in order to show that you heard them. Often upset teams will feel upset because they feel unheard, right? The example I gave earlier about a team being upset that a judge uncritically bought a closing team. Often why that ends up playing out that way is even if your call is right, maybe a judge phrased the explanation of the OA in such a way that's like, they just uncritically bought the best version of the closing team's framing, or they just said this framing won the debate and then they barely recapped the arguments or something like that. Or conversely, you do give an extension and your novel, clever framing that you thought was doing really well ended up being completely ignored in the debate. What I try to do is I try to pay careful attention when I'm judging to actually note down the words that the teams are using in order to justify their arguments. And the reason why I do that is because noting down the words that teams use specifically and noting down the exact framings, the exact nature of the way they phrase things can be really helpful in sort of recapitulating the analysis to them after the fact. What I'll try to do when I'm bringing the team that got the 4th or the 3rd into the discussion, for example, is I'll first explain what I took away from their speech in their own language and emulate or try to explain what they tried to do in the debate in their own words, before then explaining why it ended up not working. So for example, say a team in CG got the 4th, as CGs often do, because they ended up providing some nuanced and interesting framing, didn't really have a novel extension, and ended up sort of placing forth as a result of being fairly derivative with some new interesting strategic observations, but nonetheless thought those interesting strategic observations were enough to take them above top half, at least, right? Before CO came in and like demolished them. What ends up happening often is judges will just ignore that interesting framing contribution completely. Or if they do talk about it, they'll talk about it in the way other teams in the round talked about it, i.e. they'll talk about it as in like, this was not particularly persuasive, as CO said, or this was not particularly persuasive for quote unquote reason that DLO said in a POI, right? And I think that often leads to teams being demoralized and upset because they feel that their case has been sort of neglected or taken out of context. And what I try to do is I try to frame them into the round with the context they wanted to use before then explaining why it ultimately didn't work in the way it intended, i.e. their intent, according to their whip, was to bring this analysis into the round in order to beat this OO and OG claim by sidestepping analysis they gave about, I don't know, whatever. And when you do it that way, and when you use exactly the language they used, if they said, like, we brought this into the round to reframe the debates in such a way that it defangs the argument X from opening opposition, say it in exactly those words, say they tried to defang opening opposition's arguments. That might be something they say in the debate. And that helps you, I think, earn more unconscious credibility with teams because they feel that they've been heard, even if they end up not necessarily buying, at least at the outset, why they forced. They'll be far more willing to listen to you, especially if they place low in the round, because it sounds like you heard them and you did hear them, right? And you probably heard them in both worlds, but in this case, you actually explained it in such a way that they're able to follow. Cool. I could actually talk more about OA hygiene, but I'm at 50 minutes and it is now 11 in London. So I'll call it here. I will take questions now though, if any have them. Cool, we have a question in the chat. Do you have any advice on how to find courage, e.g. to take appropriately interventionist approaches or to challenge unfair expectations on extensions during a panel discussion at competitions where feedback can be hostile and based on first reactions? How can you balance judging well and performing well? This is a really good question, and I want to address it with the thoughtfulness and care it deserves because I think there's a lot of parts here. I guess the first thing is, in general, we should be nicer to each other, and competition shouldn't be hostile environments, and people should try to assume good faith from how people engage. But operating from the premise, because I'm a realist and I know this isn't always the case, I think there are a couple of ways. The first, as I noted, is being appropriately interventionist as opposed to overly interventionist or under intervening too little is largely a question of familiarity, right? And I've talked about a couple of ways sort of scattered throughout the 10 reasons as to how to become more comfortable at taking stances in DLibs. The first, obviously, is being really well-read. If you're well-read on an issue or you know the issue really well, you are more likely to be able to intervene appropriately than someone who doesn't. That doesn't mean you need to read The Economist constantly or case file like you're trying to win a major. But it does mean that maybe you read Economist Espresso with your morning coffee, right? It does mean maybe you log on to X or Blue Sky or any social media app and look at world news a bit. It does mean that you pay attention to trends in art or trends in artificial intelligence or other things that are interesting and novel and often happen. It does mean that you should think about your own personal experiences with friendships, relationships, and so on, how they shape you as a person, and consider how that might influence or impact a debate, or write it down at least a little bit. So being aware and making just learning about the world a key part of your day-to-day routine is a skill that will pay dividends, whether you want to learn how to speak, judge, or just find courage to be a little bit more appropriately interventionist in a round, especially relevant for home. Secondly, if you are concerned with hostile feedback, there are quite a few ways I think you can minimize that. The first is often where I see people getting into trouble when they end up wanting to take a more interventionist stance, for example, is they'll end up being pushy about it or feel like end up creating the perception that they're derailing the discussion because they get fixated on a point. And this is often because discussions in DLib will wind up becoming very like, I think this analysis was important. Here's my explanation. And then the chair who wants to get to the consensus call quickly, precisely, and as accurately as they can within the time constraint will be unhappy that you brought this up. So I think the way to do it, if you're a panelist, for example, is to be a bit softer in your approach. And the way I like to do it, if I'm paneling, is I like to ask, if I feel that an analysis has been neglected, I like to ask, how would you evaluate X? I'm curious about how this piece of rebuttal X is relevant in the round, how you evaluate it compared to Y material in opening government, for example. Do we have time to talk about it? And when you phrase it in that way, you're just far more likely to get a sympathetic response from your chair, because the chair is also under pressure, right, to get good feedback from you and from the teams and from the CA team, and wants to take very little time in doing it, wants to get a consensus, and wants generally not to derail the discussion off on tangents, because that can reflect poorly on them in many ways as well. So I think generally speaking, rather than raising the concern sort of bluntly, like, I think you're missing this analysis is why I think this team won, phrasing it as like, can we talk about this? Because this is my question. How does this weigh into the discussion? Will generally help a lot. And obviously, you can bolster your ability to identify those sort of key hinge points in the discussion, those important pieces of rebuttal analysis that can swing discussions, by paying attention to tracking and all the other judging fundamentals I talked about a bit in the workshop. But I think it is easier to find courage in the way that I talked about if you are phrasing it in this way that is less antagonistic. And this goes for being a chair as well. You don't want to, I think, generally go into it with an antagonistic approach, like, I don't know, like trying to persuade the wing judges with just like a blanket display of facts and logic in order to intimidate them. That's like silly and also probably not very polite. What you want to do is you want to attempt to explain by asking them, like, why do you feel that this analysis was effective? Because in my view, it did X, not Y. Really useful way of doing it. If you're chairing as well, you want to generally try to approach your wings with a degree of charitability and a degree of open-mindedness, as I talked about earlier. And you'll generally get less pushback when you are framing these questions in this way. Obviously, it's a balance. You shouldn't be, too non-assertive if you're a chair, because you need to be able to also manage a discussion. And I understand that there's also like a variety of other dynamics that can play in here due to implicit bias and things like this. Some chairs have a harder time being assertive due to the way the space is constructed. It's really unfortunate. And I don't think I want to encourage chairs to generally be less assertive, because that's bad. I think some chairs really need to be assertive. Some wings can really be derailing a discussion. But in general, if you're worried about hostile feedback, you can modulate your tone in a discussion and try, and just in general, approach DLibs not as an aura farming exercise, but as a way to sort of come to a consensus call that is equitable and fair and correct for everyone. That is, I think, where I'm at with that question. I see a follow-up, which is, are there any good examples of friendly open DLibs online? I don't think I've seen any recordings before. I haven't watched too many recorded DLibs. I've seen a few. The HWS round robin has a few recorded DLibs, I believe. There are also a few from the European round robin. I think Oxford IV one year did it as well. But it's quite rare to actually see the deliberations recorded. I think there's only like 2 or 3 of them on the internet. I think there's a few from like Madrid Worlds, I think, did a training platform where they did this, but I'm not sure if the DLib was recorded specifically. That said, I think you will be able, Amitai was going to interject.
Actually, I'm going to step in to say that, first of all, we're going to be publishing a few delibs that you can look at soon on the NAUDC training program. So stay tuned for that. And I'll also add one last question for Matt before we let him go and thank him for his workshop today, which is my question. I just briefly want to ask you. So you mentioned both in the first and eighth mistakes something that I think is correct, but is somewhat contradictory, which is that in some cases, judges tend to over-apply templates to otherwise convincing arguments. And in some other cases, the issue is that they gravitate more towards how convincing a piece of framing is, or just how convincing the argument sounds without being interventionist enough on burdens, especially regarding, how realistic the argument is. So obviously, a lot of it is the natural development through practice that you mentioned as the way to get better at that. But do you have any advice on specifically how to reconcile not wanting to implement template burdens, but also those being the burdens that you're most confident to implement on arguments that you might find convincing? Which template burdens are good for judges to still stick to?
That's a really good question, yeah. And the question basically comes down to like, you want to not overly insert yourself into sort of stock analysis, but at the same time, you need to be confident in deploying stock weighing, framing, and so on in order to come to clear and courageous, to use the way I framed in the workshop, calls, right? And I think that all of the sort of, it's important to sort of first disambiguate between like stock weighing mechanisms and sort of stock ways to compare, i.e. comparing teams on weighing, comparing teams on burdens, and argumentation. When I'm talking about stock argumentation, I was specifically referring to just the manner and way in which arguments are constructed and the sort of verbatim analysis that's written in like the Lafferty matter file and things like that. Whereas when I was talking about, being the burdens, right, that people have to fulfill and being able to intervene when a burden is missed, those burdens that I'm talking about are typically more the meta burdens, right? Like, did they end up adequately explaining the argument to the fullest possible extent, right? And I think it's important to like be aware that but it's important to be aware that this can just be a problem as well, right? Like you can obviously intervene too much in favor of a stock argument because you're trying to be, courageous and intervene in a way that you've seen done before, right? And I think the way to sort of be good at that is twofold. The first is the thing I already said, which is about consuming a very varied media style and looking outside debate for examples of how things end up playing out in argumentation and how things end up playing out in different discussions. And that's sort of like the first thing, because that like will give you a more balanced portfolio of different arguments and different weighings to draw on in a delib, right? So you'll be able to sort of snap call the stock when you need to in order to find an answer to a problem. And at the same time, you'll be able to have some additional sort of things you can draw on from outside. The second thing is you should be familiar with all of the stock argumentation. And hopefully I didn't convey that otherwise. As a judge, it's very good to be familiar with stock and it's very good to understand it. The trick is just not to get so enmeshed in stock that you aren't able to understand when it isn't winning, or that you aren't able to understand when it is being overly judiciously applied. And that's why I think the first thing I said about living a varied lifestyle comes about, and doing some varied exploration in that way. I guess the final thing I'd say here is just like, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think it's like you need to throw out specific weighing mechanisms, specific framing, and ignore it just because it is stock. I just think it is just like, and I talked about, you need to apply the same burdens to extensions as to apply to front half analysis. You should apply the same queries and interrogations that you apply to new arguments as to stock analysis. And I think that will be helpful at finding the correct intuitions. And as for like specific examples of heuristics that are useful to know in DLib, right? Obviously, they are the ones that everybody talks about, right? Which is like, did this team weigh appropriately? Did this team respond appropriately? Did this team, was this team derivative? Was this team not derivative? And everything that sort of is a subsidiary of that. And all of those things are important to understand. The trick is just that I think the burden has tilted a bit too far in the one direction, and it's good to potentially have a countervailing approach toward that. Hopefully that makes some sense. But hopefully this is also the start of further discussion about it in the community, and maybe it will spark discourse. The workshop will spark discourse about this. Cool. Thank you so much.